So thank you all for coming out tonight. My name is Elizabeth Hansen. I'm a senior research fellow here at the Tao Center, where we explore how changing technologies are influencing the practice and consumption of journalism. We sponsor and direct research like what you'll hear about tonight, and we also develop teaching materials for the next generation of journalists that are coming through the school. So I want to introduce Damian and Chris, who are going to be sharing their really phenomenal research on local news in a digital world, the adaptations of small market papers to our current digital context. So Damian is a professor of practice and Chambers Professor of Journalism at the University of Oregon. Prior to that, he had a 20-year career working in the UK and the Middle East in a variety of editorial and policy positions. Christopher Ali is an assistant professor of media studies at the University of Virginia, and he received his PhD from the Annenberg School of Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. We're really excited to have both of them here tonight to share with you their findings. So let me just tell you really quickly, they're going to spend about 15 minutes running through a kind of short overview of their report. We launched today, so you can access it via the Tao website, CJR. We also have some paper copies, which I believe are all gone. Wow, all gone. But if you manage to come and take a look at this one, you'll see, which is really great, so that this is actually the second report that we've launched from the two of them. They did a survey that was released earlier this year. So the survey is on one side, and the findings of all of their interviews are on the other. So take a look at both of those. And then we're going to have a really great panel of local journalists talking about all of the issues raised in the report. And we'll end with some Q&A, and then we have a short reception at the end, and the food will be in the back. If you need the restrooms, they are on the basement level, so you can go out the door, down the stairs, and they're in the hallway just underneath here. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris and Damian.
All right. Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and thank you all very much for coming today and spending a couple of hours, well, about an hour and then a reception for an hour, talking about local newspapers, talking about local news and the importance of local news, and what's going on in some of these developments in some of the markets that we don't hear a lot about or anything about anymore. And that was kind of the crux for a lot of our research. What we ended up doing, as Elizabeth mentioned, is we've conducted 2 studies over the last year and a half. The second, although it was the first to be released, was a survey that we did, a nationwide survey of editors and journalists at small market newspapers. And we defined small market newspapers as those with a circulation of under 50,000. So we conducted a nationwide survey and ended up having 420 responses, looking at the digital life of small market newspapers. And that's something we don't hear a lot about. We often hear about the digital life of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and of course the digital existence of the Huffington Post and BuzzFeed. But we don't hear about how newspapers like the Calhoun County Journal might be dealing with their Instagram feed, or the Akron Hometowner, or newspapers like that. And then to get a more in-depth perspective, we spent the better part of a year interviewing experts and practitioners, funders, policymakers, donors, academics, anyone and everyone who would speak to us about local news and the future of local newspapers. And that's the second part of the study, which we call kind of the landscape review, the state of the field, the state of the industry, as it were. It's taking its time to move here. All right. We had 2 research questions going into this. The first is, how are these small market newspapers responding to the challenges of what we think about as digital disruption, digital technologies interrupting their daily practices and influencing daily practices? And then how can they best prepare for the future? All right, so thinking ahead, what best practices can we recommend? Let's see if this is, there we go. And let's talk a little bit about why this matters. There hasn't been a nationwide study landscape kind of state of the industry study since 2011. This was conducted by Stephen Waldman under the auspices of the Federal Communications Commission. So we haven't really updated a lot of this data in the last 6 years. And as we all know, as our panelists are going to tell us, as Damian and I have found, I mean, the industry has changed so much in just 6 short years. And when we do talk about changes, we tend to talk about changes at BuzzFeed, at the New York Times, at the Wall Street Journal, these larger metro national newspapers. And again, we miss the stories of the small and local newspapers. And this is significant because small market newspapers represent not just a missing middle or a small minority of newspapers in the United States. They actually represent the majority, the vast majority of regularly published newspapers in this country. According to Editor and Publisher, there are 7,071 regularly published, that's daily or weekly newspapers in the United States. Of those, 6,851 of them, so a full 97%, represent what we would call small markets. And these stories are the ones that are not being told. So this is a story that we wanted to research and we wanted to bring to light and share with you today. So we had, went a little fast there. We had 3 major findings that we want to share with you today, and we're gonna race through these slides really quickly because I realize I've already talked for about 6 minutes, so I'm gonna go fast. One was the fact that we actually found a guarded amount of optimism amongst our respondents, amongst donors, amongst policymakers, amongst editors and journalists for the future, the state of and the future of small market newspapers. We also found that there is experimentation and innovation across the board. There are great examples of small market newspapers using digital tools for kind of these low risk, high reward situations. And lastly, that there is this need for nuance. And that's something I've already talked about, the fact that in all of the aggregate statistics and this kind of doom and gloom narrative that we have about local newspapers, or that we have about the newspaper industry in general, we don't drill down into the statistics of, well, what's going on in the small markets? What's going on in Bruce, Mississippi? All right, what's going on in Charlottesville, Virginia? Rather, we've got these industry-wide statistics that we're all probably familiar with, like the death of the newspaper, the death of print. So we recognize the need for greater nuance here. And like I said, this is just a small breakdown of the number of newspapers that we're talking about with relatively small circulation, the vast majority being actually not even just under 50,000, but under 30,000, right? Under 30,000 circulation, this missing majority of newspapers that we are not talking about. So this represents why we feel there is a need for nuance. But for me, the most exciting thing was this idea that there's a guarded amount of optimism amongst our respondents. Right? There's a guarded amount of optimism because people are still buying print papers, believe it or not. That has allowed them to have a little bit of a buffer in digital experimentation. Right? They don't have to compete with the hyperlocals and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal because these are not existing in smaller town America, right? So they've got a little bit of space, a little bit of breathing room to be able to experiment. So that speaks to number 4 here, change coming at a slower pace. They're often the only source of original reporting in a community. We spoke to newspapers that are not only the only source of journalism in the town, but maybe the only source of journalism in the county or even in part of the state. So they have a bit of a monopoly of news that they're able to take advantage of. Then, of course, number 3 and number 5, there's an element of trust, and there's a brand, and there's a heritage of being close to your readers. The fact that you can see the editor at the grocery store means something, and is able to newspapers are able to capitalize on this. So this speaks a little bit to optimism. And then when we think about elements like innovation and experimentation, we looked at revenue streams, which we differentiated from business models. We also saw different journalistic practices that were emerging in this space, more focused on solutions journalism, for instance, rather than just identifying problems. And then again, an evolving philosophy and approach to the practice of journalism. And we're gonna unpack all of these as we go forward. So I'm actually gonna hand this over to Damian, am I still going on? All right, I'll still go on. That's right. So talking about revenue and business models just quickly, one of the things that our respondents were obviously concerned about is, well, how do we make money, right? How do we keep this sustainable, not only in terms of practice, but in terms of financial sustainability? So we saw a lot of really interesting examples with experimentation, particularly among paywalls. Paywalls are a relatively newcomer to small market newspapers, and they're still experimenting with what works best for their community. And I was actually on NPR this morning and a call-in show, and someone called in and was really annoyed that the Virginia pilot in Virginia Beach, Virginia, had just introduced a paywall, and it had introduced a paywall that you couldn't read any article before subscribing, and he was really annoyed. And my response was, well, you have to actually give them a little bit of time to get their paywalls right. I mean, a newspaper like the Dallas Morning News has experimented with multiple iterations of paywalls over the last 10 years, and this is something that small market newspapers are just now starting to work into their business practices. We also see opportunities to spin off different services as a different revenue generating options. This has included website building, app creation, digital marketing, and printing presses, where oftentimes the newspaper, if they own the printing press themselves, will print for other services. So looking at small market newspapers are moving beyond just advertising and subscription and looking at alternative revenue models as well. And then we have some really interesting additional ideas of revenue generation, obviously including crowdfunding, maybe something that we're familiar with here, funding individual stories. Newsletters have really been a resurgence amongst small market newspapers, this kind of old school way of delivering a very specialized news product. Events, a lot of our participants and respondents and survey respondents talked about how important holding events were in communities, bringing people together at a specific time in a specific place to discuss a particular issue. Memberships were something that we talked about. An interesting thing was the idea of obituaries. Being able to, this is something that a lot of small market newspapers have never charged for, and there's actually a bit of a disagreement here about whether or not you should be charging for an obituary or whether or not you shouldn't be charging for an obituary. And we saw some really interesting mixed results about kind of the ethics and the morality around this, because it is also something that people turn to in the newspaper, you know, who died, right? And another one is this idea of surveys, introducing a survey onto the website of the newspaper where maybe you'll read a story, but a quick survey will pop up as another opportunity for revenue generation. All right, now I'm going to hand it over to Damian, who's going to walk us through some changing journalistic practices.
Thank you, Chris. Good evening, everybody, and thank you again for coming out this evening. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the changes that we've seen in terms of journalistic practice at small market newspapers and some of the strategic implications of that. The first thing, this probably comes as no real surprise, but when we spoke to journalists and also heard from journalists through the survey that we conducted at the end of last year, the beginning of this year, we found that digital output, digital production was not only standard at small market newspapers, but also an increasingly important part of journalists' time and work. That most journalists are finding that the amount of time they're spending on digital is increasing, and so too is the number of stories that they're also having to produce. Their workload is increasing, but interestingly, their working hours are not necessarily increasing. About a third of journalists said they now spend more time working in their paper than they did. So they're producing more stories in the same amount of time for more platforms. And this is creating tension, not just in terms of kind of practice and workflow in newsrooms, but also in terms of trying to understand what does success look like on digital platforms? What's the ROI in this space? Do you engage on platforms like Instagram and Snapchat and Facebook because you have to, because that's where your audience is and you can't afford to not be there? Do you go and engage in that space and hope that the business model will present itself at some point down the line? Or, in some cases, we found that publishers decided that where they have limited amounts of time and resources, they're placing their bets accordingly and therefore eschewing particular platforms. Facebook, in a number of cases, as several people pointed out to us, likes do not equal ad dollars. Alongside this, we're seeing interesting discussions around engagement, not just in the digital space, but also in terms of in real life. So the kind of traditional measures that you might see in terms of digital uniques, time on site, bounce rates, and so forth, they remain really important. But that conversation about engagement and what constitutes engaged journalism is evolving to also include questions around what is the relationship between journalists and the audience? How do you engage with those audiences online through platforms like Twitter, through your comments strategy, and so forth? But also, how do you view things like events, not just as a revenue stream, but also as a potential opportunity to find great stories, great tips, to network, and also to be more visible about your systems and processes and the issues that matter to you and to your communities? And that kind of conversation around getting out of the newsroom, trying to kind of gravitate away from air-conditioned journalism to kind of more real-life engagement with audiences was part of a wider philosophical shift that we got a sense of from many of our interviewees. A lot of them talked about, in an unprompted manner, whether kind of traditional concepts of objectivity, of distance from your community, were relevant in this day and age, and whether actually for local newspapers to survive, they need to do some things differently, which means engaging more with audiences and also telling stories in new and different ways, like Solutions, which was one model that we saw people talking to us about and which Chris has mentioned earlier. So, what does all of this, what does the 55,000 words that we slaved over 18 months mean to you? Well, let's try and boil that down into 5 slides. The first thing is to say, and this might seem obvious, but whatever local journalism will look like and local news will look like in the future, it will be different to the past. And that's important to recognize and to acknowledge, because too often we feel a lot of the conversations about local journalism are really rooted in the past, talking about how do we get back to a golden age, the way things used to be. And I think that's a fool's errand. You know, the world has moved on, and the pace of change and digital disruption that we have seen is only going to increase. So newspapers need to understand and recognize that reality and look forwards rather than backwards. In terms of how they can move forward, we believe that one fundamental part of that, in an age of information overload, is to focus on scarcity, focus on providing the kind of reporting and stories and content that cannot be found elsewhere. If you do that, then maybe, just maybe, you'll find a business model that will work, and you'll provide a content and services and products that people will pay for. That's going to mean doing some things differently. Every newsroom that we spoke to, without fail, told us the size of their newsroom over the last 2, 3, 5 years had shrunk. But when we asked the question, so what do you not do now as a result of the fact that you're a smaller shop than you once were, most people said, nothing. Now, everyone is trying to do what they have always done and actually expand that to include and encompass digital platforms. And that's clearly not sustainable. So we think that there's a strong argument to say you need to be more selective, try and identify the kind of beats and the passions of your audience, focus on that, and at the same time maybe consider taking a different approach to the importance of a local newspaper, moving away from the kind of general store model to something that's more specialist. Alongside that, we also think the business model and kind of revenue models in newspapers also needs to change. Most small market newspapers continue to be incredibly reliant on print. About 75 to 80% of their revenue still comes from print and still very advertising led. But we know that in many cases, physical print audiences are declining, and certainly print dollars, both from advertisers, are declining, and that advertising is becoming a smaller part of the overall revenue pie. So diversification is going to be fundamental to future success. Alongside this, in a world of diminished resources, we believe that partnerships and collaboration will also be fundamental to the success for small market newspapers. And we're already seeing elements of this. We've highlighted a number of examples in our reports and some examples here on the screen related to both reporting, technology, and also ad sales. So there's no area of your business, both on the business development and the content side, that can't potentially be supported and enhanced through partnership. And lastly, we believe it's incumbent on everybody in this space to start to take some ownership around the messaging and the narrative that we have around the future for small market newspapers. Both in the survey and through our interviews, people consistently told us the message that we tend to project to our audiences is that this is a dying medium. that this is an industry that is on its last legs, that has one foot in the grave. And yet we know that that's not the case. You know, in many cases, circulations both of print and digital are holding steady, if not growing, and we find on a daily basis really, really important journalism being conducted at local newspapers and local operations all across the country. And we need to do more about selling those successes, stressing the importance of local journalism and of why it matters and its contribution to democracy, to public discourse, to fighting the fake news agenda, and so forth. And that's something that everybody in this room and across that industry can be responsible for and can also take ownership of. So that's our kind of clarion call. And with that, I'm delighted to be able to hand over to Rebecca Baker, President of the Professional Society of Journalists and Deputy Head of News at the New York Daily News, who will chair our expert panel, and then we'll hand over to questions from the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Can I have my panelists join me? Hey, John. John's going to sit there.
You want to sit here?
Around you there? Let's not fall off.
Oh, okay, that's
Yeah.
Actually, John, we're going to share the mic.
Okay.
So, technical difficulties, folks. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for everyone coming out tonight. This is obviously a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I've spent my vast majority of my career in local news, and I know many of the panelists here, and some are meeting for the first time, and we've had a good conversation so far. I said, I am Rebecca Baker. I'm Deputy Head of News, New York Daily News. I'm also National President of the Society of Professional Journalists. And we're going to have the panelists take turns and introduce themselves.
Sure. I am John Enslin. I am a reporter for The Record, a paper in northern New Jersey. I'm the multimedia reporter for the paper. And like Rebecca, I am a member of the Society of Professional Journalists, where I am a past national president.
I am Anthony O'Reilly. I am an associate editor at the Queens Chronicle in Queens, New York.
I'm Anjanette Delgado. I'm the digital director and head of audience at loha.com and the Poughkeepsie Journal, and it's part of the USA Today network. And I've spent all of my 20-plus years in local news, starting in North Dakota, and then also in Florida and California, and now New York.
And I am Jahangir Khattak. I am the co-director of the Center for Community and Ethnic Media at the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism. We work with the Metro New York-based ethnic and community media, offering them different trainings, and we showcase the best of their work through our website, voicesofny.org. We give away an annual journalism award as well. We have done some research work. We do access to information programs like Newsmaker series, where we bring in different public officials and give this media an opportunity to ask questions which are important to their audiences.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Let's talk about the last point that Damian had made about the stopping the doom and gloom. Oh, it's terrible, it's awful. Tell me a little bit about what each of your news organizations has done to champion itself.
But we love doom and gloom. I mean, we're journalists. It's like where we live. What we've done, we've tried to tell people just one-on-one what it is that we're trying to accomplish. It's hard. It's hard, particularly in my paper, where we're changing a lot of what had been a traditional print-only newspaper. And there's resistance to that change, particularly among the core group of older readers. But my technique has been just one-on-one conversation and talk people down off the ledge.
I think what we at the Queens Chronicle has done is, especially last week or in the past 2 weeks, with the unfortunate elimination of DNA info in Gothamist, we came right out and we wrote an editorial to our readers saying, we're here, we're safe, we're going to be here and continue to deliver the quality journalism that you've expected of us for the past 39 years. So, we know that the media landscape is a scary place when you look at what's happening with a lot of the bigger papers sometimes. But for us, we're going to be here and we're going to do what it is that we've been doing.
And the doom and gloom is real. I mean, nobody's better at moaning about it than we are, right? But I think one thing we're doing in Westchester at LOHA.com, and the builder of the product, Avram Billig, is here in the audience, but we've built an impact tracker. And so we're looking at the impact that our journalism has out there in the community and keeping track of that so that we have a way then when we go back out to our community, whether it's at a Rotary Club speech or a letter to subscribers or even a column online or in print, we're able to tell more about the reason we exist and the reason why it's important that you might want to be a subscriber, but you also might want to be an ad sales client for us. And so we're using that sort of study where we're able to look at, this happened 2 or 3 days after we published, and this is why journalism exists and why we exist. So that's what we're doing.
And I would add that since we don't have a newspaper as such, but we work with the news media, so we are in the business of helping this media to enhance their sustainability. And that is, as I mentioned earlier, we do trainings, we showcase the work, we acknowledge the work of this media. We have a very small organization, me and my colleague Karen Painter, who is the other co-director, and we have very small staff. But we are doing big work. We are trying to organize these trainings, not just on the editorial side, but also on the marketing side, because we are looking at a very diverse media landscape in the Metro New York region, which is a bit different than what Damian and Chris have looked at, even though they have done a fantastic job, and I want to congratulate you on that. But what the media that we are working with is basically focused on very small communities. Just to give you a very, very brief, lay of the land that we have here. So in Metro New York region, we don't have the exact numbers of the media that we have that we bring in the category of ethnic and community, like hyperlocal as well as the one which covers different ethnic groups, mainly immigrants and people of color. And we have seen both the growth of this media in the changing environment, and also there are newspapers which are closing, but that's why exact number is hard. But we feel that there are more than 300 publications. Our center has produced a directory of this media, and we have about 280 in that directory, which is available both in print and online. And sustainability is a big question. The news consumption patterns are changing, just like all over the world, in the different ethnic enclaves that we have in this city. And people are going mobile. They are consuming news through their mobile devices and their computers. So it's all about sustainability, and that's what we are trying to help.
Absolutely. Angela, I want to learn a little more about the impact tracker. Is this something that all Gannett papers are doing, or is just the Journal News? And can you give me an example of an impact that was tracked?
Oh, I'd love to.
And could you check to see if your mic is on?
Am I on? Can you guys
Yeah.
hear me? Yeah. Okay. So the impact tracker, it's a web application that we built that's essentially a database. And so we made this interface so that reporters could go in, and it's important that reporters do this so they know they wrote the story, they follow through on it, and they hear about the impact of the story, and they're able to prove that, yes, this would not have happened if we had not covered the news. And so then they go and input it into this web interface that we can then, as editors, go through this, look at this, download what we need, keep track of this. So it's a web application now that we're sharing with some other newsrooms within Gannett, We have a lot more interest throughout the network, and we built it to scale up to all 100 and something newsrooms that want it. So it's a very purposeful project, I think, to help do that. An example, I have a few that are investigative, like real hardcore driven investigative, but since we're here to talk about local news, I'm going to give you an example that's real local journalism. So we have a reporter who's covering a certain community in Westchester, and he had found out that there were some nuns who were living, and it was winter, and it was extremely cold, and they're living without a boiler. Their boiler broke, and they really needed money. And they sent us this photograph of one of the elderly nuns who was sleeping under a pile of blankets because it was so cold. And they had started a GoFundMe to raise money to get a new boiler. And hadn't had a lot of success, so they reached out to us. We wrote about the story, made sure people knew about the GoFundMe, and within, I think, 2-3 days of publishing, they had enough response. Now, it's community response, but enough response from the community to buy a new boiler. So there's your local news impact.
All right, that's fantastic. Let's talk a little bit about also some innovations in technology. Obviously, that is definitely a technology leader, and to be able to track the kind of impact with an application and not just, gee, how many web hits we've had. Mm-hmm. I think those days are kind of being phased out a little bit. But talk about, if each of the panelists can talk about some innovations in technology and experimentations that you've done. John, I know you in particular have been really transformed your career over the last couple years to being a podcaster, embracing a multimedia approach to your reporting. So if you can talk about that and have each of the panels talk about a little bit about embracing technology and experimentation.
Sure. Yeah, my job has changed 100%, although the core element of reporting and telling stories has not. But the tools that I use now are so much different. For example, I've been a podcaster for the last 5 years, but a podcaster with a vengeance over the last year. I use a program called SoundCloud and a great little app called Hindenburg, which is named after the poor soul that was covering the Zeppelin disaster. But it's a great tool when you're out in the field and you're trying to record sound and edit it in your cell phone, in your smartphone, and then bring it back as a podcast a short time later. So, for example, this afternoon I was doing a podcast in a parking lot in Newark in my car, which is the only quiet place, talking to a reporter about a story that's coming out this weekend. Then on the video front, I've been even since you've seen me last, I've just been editing videos right and left, about one a day. We're using a program called Watch It. Have any of you used that or you heard of it? It's fairly simple and intuitive, and it does allow a person like myself to draw on existing video clips, existing photos, soundtracks, music, my own voice or somebody else's voice, a script, and to do it all, to turn it all in about 2 hours' time. And not a shabby product in 2 hours' time either, something that I can feel reasonably proud of. So those are two things that didn't exist 5 years ago. Three things, if you count Hindenburg. And I've been an avid new adopter, and I expect to continue to be so.
I think for us, it's definitely been a lot on the video front. Our reporters have been using Periscope or Twitter Live, Facebook Live, to just bring readers, both in Queens and outside of Queens, just live content. This is the news when it's happening. Here's what's going on. I'll give two examples. The first was we streamed the JFK protests of the first quote-unquote travel ban when there was a lot of people protesting at Kennedy Airport earlier this year. And that got about 20,000 hits, 20,000 unique viewers from all over the country and possibly all over the world who were watching, the Queens Chronicle's Twitter account stream this event. And the other thing was one of our reporters, through his own volition, just took live stream video of a very good basketball player, I don't remember his name, but from Queens, who was announcing what college he was going to be signing to. And eventually he decided that he was going to sign for Kentucky. It got to the point where so many people in Kentucky were watching that video that our reporter was trending on Twitter in the state. It was incredible, just the number of people who were watching that video as it was happening. And I think he gained like 2,000 Twitter followers from that streaming of that video alone.
Wow. So the other newsroom I work with is the Poughkeepsie Journal, and it's the oldest newspaper in New York. It's the second oldest newspaper in the United States, and so it has a long history going back to 1785, I believe. And we're doing a text message project. The project is called Hudson Valley Forward. It just launched this morning, and the way it works, we're using a tool called Ground Source, which is really neat. This is not one we developed in-house, but one we're contracting with. And it allows us to reach people through text message, but yet we're doing it with a computer interface, and we can type on the back end, and there's a nice database on the back end, so you can kind of keep this person separate from that person when they respond. And what we're doing with it is we're exploring the changing economy in the Hudson Valley. And so Hudson Valley Forward is really this exploration of how things are changing, because the Hudson Valley and Poughkeepsie in particular is it's old IBM country. And so if you grew up there, your parents probably worked at IBM. And so now what you see happening is you can be in a coffee shop in Beacon with your laptop, and you can have clients here in the city or clients in South America, and the technology is here so that you can do that. And so we wanted to explore that environment, I guess. And the idea being that from the very beginning, we didn't know what it was going to look like at the end. And that was very important for us. You know, we didn't go out and say we're going to do a traditional story form and come back that way. So we really wanted to explore it as we went. And so it's been this giant experiment. Today we launched a video series last night, leveraging the proximity to our community. We invited the 50-plus people who are messaging us back and forth to come out for a pre-screening, and just thank them with some wine and cheese and that sort of thing. And so it's a grand experiment. It's probably going to go on for another year.
So we are seeing a lot of experimentation and innovation in this media. Ethnic and community media. We have seen examples like Filipino website. It's called the Film. Its publisher last year announced an investigative reporting project, and for that she was raising $5,000. And she could not raise $5,000, but she did raise $3,000. And she used that money to produce 8 investigative reports for her website, which she promoted through mass mailing and social media. Similarly, just like you mentioned, and we heard about the report as well, that the print circulation is going down, and this is a trend which you will see pretty much everywhere. And it is very much visible in the Chinese community. We have a very large Chinese media presence in New York City. America's largest, I would say, ethnic newspaper is a Chinese language newspaper, which has a daily circulation of more than 200,000. That newspaper, like their executive editor himself told me that when we started looking at our numbers, which were going down circulation-wise, we saw that our website was getting more visitors. So in order to engage the visitors more, they changed their reporting pattern. What they did was they gave their reporters high-capacity smartphones and asked them that every time you go to cover some event, make a short video as well. So they would post that video with the stories that would go online to promote and to engage. And then they were trying to monetize that and make some money out of it, which is hard because For them, I'm not sure how much they're making, but I'm talking about really small guys. We did a conference on advertising last year at the J School, where we had 5-6 panels, and we wanted to explore how far this digital age offers, what kind of opportunities it offers to this very small media. And we found that, unfortunately, when you are going at national level, the national advertisers may not be too much interested unless they are looking at some niche markets or they want to reach some niche markets. Other than that, the numbers are so small, even though this media is doing such an important work, that it is being picked by the mainstream newspapers. And I can give you many examples for that as well. But to tell you, because I don't want to take all the time, just to say that this media is innovating. It is using technology as much as it can. We had a Bangladeshi newspaper which used to sell their newspaper, but the advertisers were not getting any response because their circulation went down. So they made their newspaper free and they launched their website. Until then, they did not have a website because they had this thinking that if we put everything online, nobody will buy our newspaper. So they made their newspaper free and now they have a very vibrant website. So they are trying to make money from there as well.
Wonderful. Well, I think we can open it up to some questions now. Okay. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, I had a couple questions I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the names, but from the Scarcity Journal. The question is about the impact tracker. I guess several questions. For one, is the impact tracker data public, or do you envision a sort of public access to the impact tracker data? And the second question is, how do you verify that a certain story had a certain impact and draw the link between that? And how do you sort of control for gaming that system where like certain reporters or people like...
Right, yeah, and I think it's a real issue and one we thought hard about as we were building it, because most of your metrics out there are quantitative, right? And it's undeniable that this happened. And this one, it's more qualitative. So this is another reason that we had reporters be the ones entering this in, is because we felt they were the ones who could verify that information. And so it's a bit of an honor system, but we also, by working in that newsroom, we understand when it kind of smells funny, it's not right, you know? So we're a good check on that as well. So we do ask them to check and prove and document that as much as possible, to the extent that it can be. And it's oftentimes going back to the original source and saying, you know, when in the example of the donations, you know, did you find that this happened, you know, after the immediate day that we published? You know, was there a marked increase when you saw that we published? Whether it's public or not, what we've done to this point is we've published some of that in columns and different things like that. I'd love to make the entire database front-facing, and so people could go in and look whenever they wanted to. But right now, I feel like we're in version 2.0, and I have kind of a roadmap for down the future, and that's one of the things we're considering. I wouldn't say it's a lock, but we're going to explore that for sure.
Any other questions for either the panelists or Chris and Damian on their presentation?
Hi, I'm really interested in, with small markets, in terms of the concern regarding burnout, especially with younger staff and this expectation of, you know, developing or having this multitude of skills to bring in these newer audiences and also engage. But there, you know, the concern that if you're tasked with reporting and also shooting video and also being at an event, and following on, you know, building a Twitter following and helping all of this stuff. Journalists work a lot of unpaid hours, but it feels like, especially in small markets where you have a smaller team, to do a lot more things and there's not as many roles. the concern, especially not even talking about like diversity or increasing gender, which we've seen the data hasn't really moved in a lot. But I would really like to hear about how, from the management side or from upper team level, concerns about how to deal with preventing burnout, especially in small markets where their turnover often is much higher.
Yeah, so when I started at the Chronicle, which has been I've been there about 3 years now, we had a newsroom of 6 people, and now we're at 5. It's a drop off of 1 person. But it makes a huge difference when you're dealing with a newsroom of single-digit people. So what we determined is there's a whole portion of the borough where we split up the coverage of that area. So not only do we have the responsibility of our own beats and the beats that we had, when we signed on, but now we have the addition of, okay, who's going to keep track of what's going on in Long Island City or Jackson Heights? So, there is that concern, and the publisher knew there would be that concern when he made that decision. He told us, it's going to be an added responsibility. But I think what's happened, at least with us, is he'll notice, if somebody has been to 5 night meetings in a row, or has been to, 6 press conferences in the past 3 days, what have you, and say, why don't you have a freelancer take care of this, or why don't you, cover this kind of remotely, maybe. So there's a lot of, the publisher keeping track of the journalists, because sometimes journalists can be stubborn and say, no, I've got this, and want to push themselves because they're trying to prove to, themselves, their audiences, their publisher, I can take everything on. But for us at least, there is a lot of, the management keeping an eye on the journalists, saying, I know you want to prove that you're dedicated, and you have, but you need to take it easy. You need to take tonight off. You need to, say this night meeting maybe not that worth it to push yourself to cover a 6th meeting in a row. So we're very fortunate at Chronicle that we do have a publisher who looks out for us and makes sure that we are, we're taking care of ourselves physically, mentally, and what have you.
Thank you. I just also want to pick up, this was actually a theme. I'm really glad you raised this, because this was an issue that emerged during the survey that we did earlier this year. And we found a number of kind of issues that emerged from that. The first of which was not just burnout, but actually a real problem in terms of retention. That we were seeing a lot of newspapers talking about the fact that young journalists would reach a certain point in their life where they said, I can no longer work these hours or continue to work these hours for this pay. And that therefore the sector risks losing people in kind of like their mid to late 20s who might not ever come back, or if they do, it's not for a very long time. So that was one issue that was expressed. We also had a number of publishers talk to us very honestly, although usually off the record, about the fact that many of their young journalists have to have 2nd or even 3rd jobs to be able to sustain and afford to be a journalist at a small market newspaper. So they might be doing corporate comms, copy editing, kind of other work, kind of using the skills that they use day to day, but because the kind of standard pay wasn't necessarily enough to make ends meet. And that's clearly a risk, as you mentioned, in terms of that just reinforces all of the diversity issues with which we are very aware. That there are very real financial barriers for broadening the diversity and plurality of voices and backgrounds and experiences that we see in newsrooms. And we desperately need that. And I don't know what the answer to that is, but it's something that we at least need to be aware of and start having a conversation about it. I have the mic, I'll now hand them around.
Hi. Damian and Christopher referenced paradigm shift in terms of, objectivity and sort of the legacy media, legacy journalism model. And I wondered how much that's discussed among you all at the local outlets, at the local level, if at all.
How much we talk about print?
How much you talk about sort of the digital revolution impacting the way you think about the journalism that you produce in terms of sort of the normative framework, not necessarily the ethics, but sort of objectivity in particular, and the idea, more solutions oriented, that sort of thing. Has that come up in your newsrooms at all, or with people you speak with?
I would say it comes up all the time, but now it's more reality than maybe, say, 5 years ago where it was more novelty. Now we just enter these discussions because it's just journalism for us, I would say.
Is it an explicit conversation, or upon reflection, is it something that you think has become reality?
I would say more upon reflection. Again, going back 5 years, we used to talk about, look at this new thing, and here's how this is going to change us. And there was a lot of discussion about that. And I think we're at this point now where what we do most of the day is digital journalism. And so to talk about it in that framework, it feels kind of odd at this point. It's more unusual to talk about print and the older ways of doing things.
I think at least on the objectivity front that you brought up, it does come up for us because, as Chris and Damian brought up, we do have our ears closer to the audience. So when a thing comes up in the community, an issue comes up, usually we have the attention of the community members and the people who are reacting to, a street redesign, the city coming in and doing something different than the people have been used to for the past 30 years. So we're obviously telling it from the side of the community members, the people who live in those areas, and it may seem like we're not giving the city a fair shake. Oh, the city wants to do this because they think it'll be better, and they may know better than the people who live there. But we're telling it from the perspective of the people who live in these communities. So we do have to sit down and say, well, let's tell this person a story that they don't like this thing that's going on, but let's also make sure that we're telling both sides of the story. Here's why the city is doing this project that everyone is upset about.
I just want to add that I think same thing is happening in the community and ethnic media as well. Even though the scope of their reporting may be a bit limited because they are serving a very niche market, they are serving one particular group or one particular neighborhood, so their reporting will be focused on that particular neighborhood or the community. And in terms of reporting, earlier on it was mentioned that the pressure and like they had 6 reporters in the newsroom, now 5. But in the community and ethnic media world, majority of the media is run by very, very few people. A newspaper publisher may be wearing all possible hats that you can think of in a newspaper. He may be the publisher, he may be the circulation manager, he may be the advertising manager, he will be editor, he will be everything. So they are always under tremendous pressure, and they do burn out. And secondly, you do see some changes in their reporting style as well. For example, since for any community, the local community events are the basic news that they are telling. So at times the reporters may not have time to write the stories. So what they do is they will have a whole page, an entire page full of photographs of that event. So that's how they are covering it. And it may be because of 2 reasons. One, because that person may not have too much expertise on any particular subject. Like, for example, somebody is covering education, and it depends on the community. If a newspaper is focused on a community which is reflecting or covering a new immigrants, so that reporter himself or herself may be in the process of assimilation and understanding the system to report on it. So they have different styles of reporting that you will see, and different practices, and which are acceptable as well in those communities.
And if I may, just to follow up also on the digital aspect of it as well, I think 15, 20 years ago, when we were writing about a community issue, really the only people who might be reading it are the people in the community who get that newspaper. But just to give a very local example, I had once a 2-sentence mention about an RV that was parked on a block for 6 weeks straight. It was a story that I did as part of a precinct community council where the cops tell the community, here are all the issues that are going on. And so I published it thinking, okay, the cop is talking about an RV being parked on a street for 6 weeks. I get 10 emails from somebody representing an RV equality coalition, I forget the exact name of it, saying, you're being unfair to this RV owner. You're not telling his side of the story. You have to ask why he's parked on the street. I was like, I'm not trying to be biased against the RV owner, just, But, be a digital age in which anybody can read your content, not just the people in your community, it really does bring up that question as well. How am I being fair? Because there's going to be so many people with so many different opinions and views reading this, not just the people who live in the area that I cover.
Did you hear from the RV owner?
No, he moved.
Thank you. This question is mostly for Ms. Delgado and Ms. Baker about how you've seen the business models change within your companies and how different revenue streams have changed for how the workload for each reporter. So if the business model stays the same and this is how much money you get from print or advertising, that then leads to more work for each member of staff as the newsrooms shrink. So just some examples of how the newsroom's business models have changed and what that means for each staff member's workload in that process.
Do you want to try that first?
Sure. Thank you. Well, at the Daily News, we obviously as every newspaper has less staff than it has. I have been at the Daily News only since beginning of August. So, but the issue of staff burnout, and I do manage a team of reporters, and I'm very conscious of, how long they work, and we pay overtime. So if they do work, we pay them for their extra time. But even if they get overtime, I'm conscious of, if you need to leave early on a Friday or something like that, that's fine. I'm at a paper now where we have a whole team of people, and now we have been acquired by Trunk, the Tribune online content company, and obviously we are now in the midst of a lot of change. And a lot of restructuring. We'll have a new publisher, editor-in-chief and publisher at the beginning of the year. So a lot of change is on its way. How that will impact advertising or revenue remains to be seen. I think we are already working on sharing content with the Tribune company, with the Chicago Tribune, Los Angeles Times, Hartford Courant, other papers around the country. So that's definitely one aspect. But when I was editor of the New York Law Journal, where I was several years before I joined the Daily News, yes, revenue was always an issue. And one of the things that the New York Law Journal and its sister publications did was make money from holding events. Giving lawyers lifetime achievement awards, giving attorneys professional achievement awards, attorneys who did lots of pro bono work, representing indigent clients for free. These are high corporate lawyers who do not need to do any of this work, but they do it because they care and they want to give back. So we awarded for that. We awarded law firms who made strides in diversity, law firms that have made some impact on society. So we recognized Rising Stars, 40 Under 40. These are young lawyers that are coming up through and who already have making an impact. And we actually recognize women leaders in law. So all of these events are significant revenue generators. And they allow us to do the good journalism and to pay the journalists a decent salary and overtime and whatever to be able to keep the news going. And it's a definite revenue stream that I think other papers are going to be looking at seriously if they're not already doing it.
Can I add to that? As a former Guild shop steward, I used to advise our members out in Denver, look, you do what you can in the time that you have. And it's on you to make the best creative use of your time, not to just simply punch in, punch out. I find with digital that it's possible to work endlessly. if you want. But I don't think that's the definition of a professional journalist. I think you try to set limits. Like tonight, I'm here. I decided not to do something. I will do it during a non-traditional hour instead, tomorrow morning. But I will get it done. I don't think of work anymore in terms of like 9 to 5. I think of it more in terms of projects. But I also don't believe in just, cutting a vein open and bleeding.
Right. So I joined Gannett in '99, and we were a subscription and an ad business in '99, and we're still a subscription and ad business. Subscription has changed to include digital. Advertising has definitely changed to include digital. We're also doing events. Gannett is exploring a lot more business-to-business relationships, not just business-to-consumer relationships or the traditional ad model. So as all of that changes, I think as you work in the newsroom, you understand what those factors are that affect the business and how they impact you. And so a traditional ad business, for instance, survives on page views. And it's easy in that sort of system to just want more and more and more. And I think one of the things that we do to sort of avoid the burnout and to keep that all in check for the newsroom and to still continue to make a smarter product at the end of the day. And I work for a very good editor, Tracy Bauer, who's very careful to make sure that we're not just doing more with less. We use data very strategically to help us decide where our audience is responding, what's the most important thing we do, and especially to echo what was in the report, what's unique and local that we can do for our communities. And so it's a very data-driven approach, but with that in mind.
For those of you who know about your digital platforms, this question is about what are the websites that are referring people to your stories? Is it primarily like Twitter and Facebook that links to them, or do people find your stories through Google searches, or are there still a lot of people who just go directly to the page of your newspaper and click on the stories? Anybody who has a sense of that, could you comment on it?
I think for at least my website, it sort of really depends on the story sometimes. We're kind of in the stage where we'll upload a story or two every day, but we'll do a mass upload when our paper edition comes out, which is every Thursday. So we'll upload all the stories that we've written on Thursday, usually around noon to 1 o'clock. So our audience knows to check our website at noon, 1 o'clock. So we always see a spike in traffic at that time. So there's always, our biggest readership is when we do our mass upload and every story is up. But if there's a popular story, just for example, the one that got the biggest attention was we wrote a story about a McDonald's that was going to be torn down and renovated, and just people on Facebook reacted to that greatly, and it got all these different shares. I don't know, for us at least, if it's just one particular website. I think it really does depend on if something gets picked up on Facebook, if it captures the attention of the readers, or it could be something on Twitter that they see that gets retweeted, and the right person who has 10,000 followers retweets it, and all their followers retweet it as well.
I just want to add, in the ethnic and community media side, it depends on the community. For example, East Asian communities are very active on WeChat. So those newspapers are using that platform to promote their work. The others are active on Facebook. So you will see a lot of promotion on the Facebook. And then Twitter certainly is there. We did a survey. It was a study that we did last year with the University at Albany, and we wanted to see how this media is using the internet and the social media, and we found that 82% of the respondents, and it was based on a survey of 103 ethnic newspapers, and we found that 82% of the respondents had a social media account. And more than, I think 32% or more than that were posting more than 3 times a day on social media. So it depends on the community. So people are very strategic. They know which community is active on which platform. And then they also look at the timing. When are people looking at those mediums? And then they send out their tweets or Facebook posts or WeChat posts, just keeping in mind that when is the highest traffic time. So they do that research and use that very intelligently, and they do get results.
All right, well, I want to thank all the panelists. So give them a hand, please. I want to thank you for coming out. I want to thank Damian and Christopher for putting together this incredible report. Please give these guys a hand for all their countless hard work and hours. And I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight. This is an important discussion, and please support your local newspaper.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening. Please enjoy some refreshments in the back.
Great. How are you, Madam President?